I'm really focused on AI and national security threats with a focus right now on emergency preparedness, which is all about how can the federal government improve its ability to detect and respond to time-sensitive AI national security threats.
I love
with that in mind, I can talk to you about all sorts of other things in the AI and AI safety space as well. Would you like to hear more about emergency preparedness, or are there other topics on your mind that you also want to prioritize in this meeting? That's kind of how I'll do
That's
this.
so good, Akash. That's so good. I've never heard the term emergency preparedness applied to AI risk before in my entire life, and it's great because it's like baked in the language of things government cares about right now.
You know, there's so much we can draw from. I've been very excited about what I'm calling emergency preparedness, because in the counterterrorism world, in the pandemic preparedness world, in the nuclear security world, this concept of preparedness already, there's already an understanding of it. There's not as much of an inferential gap as with other things. And a nice
and they know they have to put budget to it too, right? It's like emergency preparedness is a big ticket item. This is not like some soft thing that like we're like thinking about, like we're doing it.
And another nice property is it gets us away from some of the debates on like exactly how likely is a particular threat from occurring. I think the preparedness world is much more comfortable saying, hey, we are dealing with very uncertain events. We don't know exactly what, you know, so-and-so terrorist group is going to do, or exactly how so-and-so state actor might get nuclear weapon. But what we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, we're going to try to map out any threats that seem credible, that seem plausible, and make sure we're prepared for them. And that's a very different type of conversation than conversations that are like, you know, this is going to happen with 99% or like 90% certainty, right? With AI, I think there's an understanding that people are not very good at predicting things. I mean, certainly government people are very, you know, much like, hey, we don't know what's going on here. We don't understand how the technology works. And so the preparedness frame says you don't need to have certainty. You don't need to understand exactly what risks are worth paying the most attention to. But if they meet some sort of threshold of plausibility, if there are at least some credible experts who are worried about these really big impact events, big impact national security threats, we should probably have a playbook in place to make sure we are doing the right things to detect those threats. And if we detect something, we're not just like figuring out on the fly, oh, what do we do now? We've had some people thinking about if we see X, we should do Y.
Welcome to For Humanity, an AI Safety Podcast, episode number 28, AI Safety equals Emergency Preparedness. I'm John Sherman, your host. Thank you so much for joining me. I think we have a really great show for you this week. We're going to talk about a big, new, exciting idea, AI safety as emergency preparedness. This is the AI Safety Podcast for the general public. No tech background required. This podcast is solely about the threat of human extinction from artificial intelligence. Please like, share, subscribe, tell a friend, and donate if you can so that more people can hear the messages this podcast is all about. Okay, so before we get into this week's interview, I have a story for you, and it is a good one. Last week, I got an invitation to go to an event out of the blue at the National Press Club in D.C., where my alma mater, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, was hosting the Anthony Shadid Award Ceremony, a very prestigious journalism award named for an alum, Anthony Shadid, who was killed as a working journalist. I went for one reason, to talk to reporters about AI risk. The big draw for the event was CNN's chief congressional correspondent, Manu Raju, who is a Wisconsin alumni. So I went, and it was a really cool, really, incredible event, incredible journalism on display there. And at one point, they opened it up for questions. They passed out note cards for people to write their questions on. AI was not on the agenda of this ceremony at all, but I had different ideas. My question was very clear. This is what I wrote exactly. Sam Altman openly admits his technology could end all life on Earth. Why isn't this on cable news every night? On my note card. That's what I wrote. So this is where it gets wild, and I have a little video to show you in just a bit here. So the person running this ceremony was the dean of the University of Wisconsin School of Journalism, Kathleen Bartson Culver. I watched Dean Culver take out a stack of note cards with all the questions on them, reorganize them, and then start asking the questions. I was a bit stunned when she hit my note card question second out of the gate, but then I was floored with what happened next. I saw her pick up my note card that I had written that exact question on. Looking at that note card, the question read, Sam Altman openly admits his technology could end all life on Earth. Why isn't this on the cable news every night? The dean of the University of Wisconsin School of Journalism personally, right there in that moment, live in front of me, whitewashed existential risk out of my question, live in front of my eyes. She says to Manu Raju, holding my note card, Sam Altman says AI has risks. What's that risk we're facing? That was her question based off of my note card. Real time, 2 icons of journalism, X risk, surgically removed. It happened so fast, I wasn't quite ready with my camera in time, but I did get it out just a second later. Here is what I got. Apologies for the poor camera work.
Yeah, what's the risk that we're facing?
I mean, it's a question I can't answer other than having seemingly interpreting a Tim fan and being scared they are world. But I mean, obviously, New York Times views it as a real threat to their business model. They have another is of course sued OpenAI, Microsoft, content, the content AI warnings and stealing their content. So obviously they do it is a real threat to their operations. I'm sure people into it some ways as well. I think also the disinformation, because disinformation is such a thing that we need to be worried about. This election cycle, future election cycles, images that are doctored that look real, videos, and people see on TikTok and not from reliable news sources. I mean, we have actually a very, our network is a very aggressive operation to make sure that things that people see on social media are actually real before it goes on TV, it goes online. That's obviously important, but obviously not everyone gets their news that way. They see it on TikTok or whatever else. That has it can have a huge impact on the election.
If I can add my 2 cents. I was just about to say,
yes.
You have so much expertise here. Please chime in. I won't, because I could talk about this for hours. My mantra is to panic responsibly. I have stickers for anybody that would like one. So just remind yourself of that when it comes to this, because I think that, there's the doomsayers and it's those that say AI is going to save the world. The truth will be somewhere in the middle as we're thinking about this.
The truth will fall somewhere in the middle. No, it won't. What a catastrophic misunderstanding of AI. Journalists have always been able to find a historical precedent for any topic, and historically the truth is very often in between the two sides somewhere, but not here. There is no half extinct. There is no half utopia. It's one or the other. I went up after the program and I talked with Manu Raju, and he could not have been a nicer guy. We shared in some Wisconsin football nerd chatter. That was awesome. And then I hit him with AI risk, just one-on-one. I said to him, so here's what I'm here to talk to you about. I drove from Baltimore for this. Sam Altman openly admits that his work could kill your kids and mine. I believe the greatest threat to my kids is the work Sam Altman is doing. And next time he comes to Capitol Hill, I want you to ask him about that and ask him when he got consent from the public to risk our lives. He was like, well, when you put it like that, that's pretty crazy. And he gave me his card. So I emailed him, no response yet from Manu Raju, but stay tuned. I think it certainly made an impression. Okay, so let's get now to today's guest and his big idea I am so excited to tell you about this week. Akash Wasil is an AI policy researcher who moved to DC to meet with lawmakers and their staffs and convince them about AI existential risks and other AI risks. His idea to frame AI safety as emergency preparedness, I think, is pure genius. Hey,
Hey,
Akash. How are you?
Doing well, doing well. Excited for this.
Awesome. Me too. I'm really excited for this. I like the color panel you got going on behind you. Very nice.
Yeah, Dave, my housemate, was like, "Oh, you're doing a podcast? Let me set up this weird background thing." I was like, "Okay."
It's working. I like it.
Cool.
So let's just start off from the top. I always like to start these off on sort of a personal note. Like, tell me a little bit about yourself and what got you pulled into this AI risk thing we are all up in now. Obviously, we're all up in it, but some of us are choosing to take a more active role. You've done that. What brought you to this in the first place?
Sure. So my background's a bit interesting here, where I was originally studying clinical psychology in a PhD program at the University of Pennsylvania, and I was doing a lot with technology and mental health. So I was looking at smartphone applications for common mental health problems like depression and anxiety. And through that work, I was learning a bit about AI in the context of AI chatbots for mental health treatments, and AI techniques and ML techniques that could personalize treatment recommendations. I wrote a paper with some folks about how AI was being used in sort of personalized medicine in psychiatry and psychology to sort of say, all right, based on these variables, this person should get cognitive behavioral therapy, but this person should get medication, for instance. Really interesting and I think useful stuff in the mental health space.
Yeah, super useful, real world, like immediate use case AI stuff. Amazing.
Yeah, like AI for healthcare, AI for mental health. And as part of that work, I was learning more about AI more broadly, including generative AI, large language models. And some folks were giving some workshops and hosting some conferences about the transformative potential of really powerful AI systems. And I ended up going to some of those and thinking, okay, like people are saying AI is going to change the world. This is kind of weird. I started reading some articles and some books. And I started to think that I was convinced enough about the hype that I wanted to take a gap year and go investigate it for myself and be like, okay, do I really buy that AI is going to be so transformative and going to pose such serious risks to society? So I moved to the Bay Area. This was before ChatGPT. This was 2022. And I started talking a lot with some of the AI and AI safety folks there, including at several of the nonprofits and several of the frontier AI labs. And started just dabbling, learning, researching, working sort of, part-time things here and there. And then eventually ended up concluding that I did think that there's a serious enough chance that AI would be quite transformative, quite risky. And I transitioned into the AI policy space with a focus on some of the national security threats and catastrophic threats that listeners to this podcast are familiar with.
Yes. Amazing. All right. So you have this awakening. You realize this is sort of a calling, I guess, or, something you wanted to commit yourself to. So where do you go from there? I think a lot of us have these thoughts of like, I want to help. How did you put yourself in position to be like, actually helping? Because we're going to get into it, a little bit, but I think the work you're doing is really important, fascinating, and needs to be done. So how did you sort of walk that road?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Let me think back to the road walking phase. I think for the first, let's say 6 months or so, it was really a lot of meeting people and learning and upskilling, essentially. Going to a bunch of dinners and lunches and happy hours and talking to a lot of folks about AI safety, about AI governance.
And this is in San Francisco with the people that are actually doing the stuff?
Yeah, this was in Berkeley and San Francisco, the Bay Area. It has a very vibrant AI community, obviously, but also a very vibrant AI safety community. And I think this was 2022, where I think there was also a lot more emphasis on sort of outreach and bringing new people to the space. I think right now things have shifted, where a lot of people who were more focused on outreach are now like, there's so much going on. We need to just do our actual technical work, or we need to do our actual governance work. But I think there is still a pretty vibrant scene of people who are interested in talking about AI safety and thinking about AI safety. So I think there was a lot of that. And then one thing that was quite helpful was a lot of people were just saying, hey, ultimately you do have to read a lot of the stuff for yourself. So going in and reading a bunch of the papers and a bunch of the debates and a bunch of the arguments between leading thinkers was quite valuable in terms of forming my opinions. There was this one moment where after I had returned from India, actually, for a sort of AI safety outreach project, one of my colleagues grabbed me and another colleague of ours and was like, hey, I know you guys have been doing a lot of outreach stuff, but I actually think we need you to think more about macro strategy. Like, let's really dive in and write some stuff up about, like, why do we think AI risk is high right now? Or, like, well, A, do we think AI risk is high? B, if so, why? And C, what are some of the levers or some of the factors that we could pull in order to make the world safer? Like, very kind of high level, abstract kind of research.
Right.
And this led me, and I think the three of us really, to start prioritizing AI governance and AI policy a bit more. This was before the recent wave of AI policy. Part of me is like, oh, we predicted perhaps a few months before others that the AI governance and policy space, and in particular involving governments, was going to be quite crucial to reduce some of the competitive pressures and race dynamics that are fueling a lot of the AI risk, in my view.
Yeah.
And so that experience of just having a few months to like really dive in and write out like what are the reasons why I think things are scary and what are the things that I think the world could do to make things better ended up sort of nudging me to transition into the AI governance and AI policy space a bit sooner than I think I would have otherwise.
Okay. And so tell me about who you're working for and the kinds of work that you're doing now.
Yeah, great. So I'm currently an AI policy researcher with Control AI, which is a nonprofit. It's based, coughing. It's based in London. I'm based in DC because I do a lot of our US policy focused work. And right now we are doing a lot of policy development work. We're thinking a lot about what kinds of policies we want to be pushing for as we're thinking about how to reduce risks from superintelligence and very powerful AI systems. I also get to do a lot of engagement with folks in DC. I have some experience talking with congressional offices. I've written a bit about this. I have some experience talking to executive branch folks. Just this week, to give you like a more concrete story, I'm writing up some feedback on this thing called the Future of AI Innovation Act that the Senate has introduced through Senator Cantwell's team. I'm giving some feedback on the Romney team's two-pager about a potential licensing scheme for frontier AI systems. And I'm going to be reviewing some of the Department of Homeland Security safety and security guidelines for AI in the context of critical infrastructure. So it's a lot of like responding to things that are coming out from government and meeting people. Mm-hmm.
That's amazing. And so those organizations, those Senate offices, those organizations are reaching out to you to say, what is the Control AI perspective on this thing we're doing?
It's a mix of both. Sometimes it's like we are, contacted sort of as an institution. Sometimes it's like a matter of being at the right happy hour at the right time. Like I have, reached out to a bunch of people and met a bunch of people through happy hours. And so now I have my own personal network. The DHS stuff is public. So, and actually all three of the things I just mentioned, the Cantwell bill, the Romney two-pager, and the DHS safety and security guidelines are public. And so oftentimes groups explicitly say, hey, look, we're looking for feedback on this. Like the Romney two-pager at the very end is like, hey, we are open to feedback from anyone, and you can send it to this email by this date. So sometimes it's like you meet someone and you're like, hey, are you looking for feedback on this? Sometimes they come to you, and sometimes they just come to the whole world and they're just like, we want comments from anyone on this.
Sure. So it's a beautiful time right now, I feel like, in AI risk and AI safety, and we just have lots of organizations popping up and sort of grassroots efforts. Tell me where Control AI fits into the landscape of AI risk awareness and policy organizations.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I'll speak as myself. I won't be representing the official policy for all of the things I say. I'm not representing my employer, just representing myself.
Sure.
One thing I really appreciate about Control AI is that I think it's really coming in with the perspective of what would be best for the world. And I don't think it is sort of as influenced by the sort of needs of the big corporations as some of the other folks in AI governance are, which I think can give a valuable perspective. I think they are more willing to call out things when there are things that need to be called out, or highlight when, for example, labs are doing things that might be not as responsible or cautious as some of the folks in the nonprofit world might prefer. I also think Control AI has a very go out there and talk to actual policymakers spirit, which I've appreciated. In the UK, we did a big push on deepfakes, and as part of that, we had a bunch of members of parliament basically endorse this campaign that we're doing and sort of sign on to some statements about the concerns around deepfakes and the need for provisions across the supply chain to address deepfakes. And I think now, as we're preparing some of our more national security-focused, catastrophic risk-focused stuff, it's quite exciting to me that we've had this experience interacting with policymakers, both in the UK and the US, and I'm quite excited about the, how would I frame it? I think some groups are more reluctant to talk about some of the threats from, say, superintelligence or some of the threats from, say, AI that is able to automate research and development and autonomous agents that are taking actions against us. I think policymakers more intuitively understand why AI that can develop bioweapons is dangerous. But if you tell them AI is going to automate research and development and then it's going to get really, really powerful, that's not necessarily intuitively all that scary compared to, say, the bioweapon case. And I think some of the most valuable work, I suspect, we might be able to do on the messaging and communication side will be trying to make sure that those harder to understand, less intuitive threat models that are still very important are actually getting the time of day.
Nice. This is very top of mind because I just got off the Pause AI Discord where we were talking about something that I think is really relevant to this, and I'm really interested in your thoughts on it. So we have X risk, we have job loss, we have bad actor terrorism. How do you decide which of those tools to implement and with which audience? In other words, if you, as I do, believe to your core that X risk is the most serious risk, but that maybe job loss might come first in the chronology, or certainly that job loss is an easier to comprehend, easier to sell idea than no living things on Earth. So how do you, in your mind, think about how those who are concerned about AI risk should sort of prioritize, order the arguments that we're making about job loss and X risk? Are they at the expense of the other? Can they work collaboratively with each other? What are your thoughts about how each one is used?
Yeah. My own personal opinion is that there is a lot of area where AI risk folks and just AI governance folks in general can contribute to multiple conversations at once. I think there is a lot going on in AI policy. So, one might want to specialize in certain areas. But it hasn't, for me, been so overwhelming that I'm not able to have some opinions on job loss conversations, have some opinions on deep fake conversations, have some opinions on AI deployed in the context of critical infrastructure conversations, for instance. And I think in the US, at least, there's so much demand for AI expertise in a variety of areas that I think my main advice for maybe, let's say, a hypothetical person who's entering into AI policy in the US would be have a focus area, right? Make sure you are the expert in some subdomain. But if you have capacity, don't be afraid to also offer your input and your expertise on various other issues here. And I also think there are alliances to build with groups who are concerned about other harms from AI. And I think that there's this balancing act that I think is very valuable and hard. I don't think I've mastered it or fully am perfect at it. But there's a balancing act between bringing your perspective to the table and meeting people where they're at. And so I do think it's important for me to make sure that I'm coming in saying, hey, one thing I think is particularly neglected in the current conversation in the US are these risks from autonomous agents, are these risks from intelligence explosions or massive improvements in AI research and development that occur so quickly that our safeguards don't keep up. I think one thing that's neglected is the competitive pressures fueling the race toward very, very powerful AI systems. Meanwhile, other people might not really be there yet, or other people might be focusing on other things. If I talk to a congressional office and they're interested in AI and national security threats, but a lot of their questions are about China, or a lot of their questions are about bioweapons, or a lot of their questions are about making sure that we're staying competitive, right? have to, I feel like it's my responsibility to have opinions on those topics as well, and meet people where they're at in terms of helping them get closer and closer to a
Right.
of understanding.
And so that's so interesting. I think it important, like, I think just a little light went off in my head, and it's like, I'm always thinking about what am I going to say to people when you bring up the topic, right? So what is your entryway? What is your welcome mat to the conversation? And I think what I hear you saying is maybe it's not a statement, it's a question, right? So if like the start of the conversation, the welcome mat is like, where are you on this? What are your concerns? And if you hear from them job loss, then maybe that's a doorway that you can take. That's a softer, easier entry than going straight to X risk. But so it's like the framework of this starts with a question, not a statement, is a powerful concept. I think it could be.
It can. I think one thing I'll just clarify is I think it depends a lot on the audience. So some of the congressional offices, let's say, and some of the executive branch folks, they're tasked with AI stuff. Like their boss, their senator, or their representative is saying, I'm going to take the lead on AI, or I'm going to want to introduce AI legislation. And then if you're talking to a staffer from one of those offices, it's very different than if you're talking to a staffer who's just generally curious and generally interested. I think for the offices that are working on a particular angle of it, usually coming in and asking them, like, where are you at? What feedback would be most helpful to you? Here are some thoughts I have on the draft legislation you already released, is often a great way to get the conversation going. With sort of a randomly selected office, I'll usually start by saying, hey, I'm Akash. Here's what I'm focusing on. I'm really focused on AI and national security threats with a focus right now on emergency preparedness, which is all about how can the federal government improve its ability to detect and respond to time-sensitive AI national security threats.
I love
with that in mind, I can talk to you about all sorts of other things in the AI and AI safety space as well. Would you like to hear more about emergency preparedness, or are there other topics on your mind that you also want to prioritize in this meeting? That's kind of how I'll do
That's
this.
so good, Akash. That's so good. I've never heard the term emergency preparedness applied to AI risk before in my entire life, and it's great because it's like baked in the language of things government cares about right now. You know,
there's so much we can draw from. I've been very excited about what I'm calling emergency preparedness, because in the counterterrorism world, in the pandemic preparedness world, in the nuclear security world, this concept of preparedness already, there's already an understanding of it. There's not as much of an inferential gap as with other things. And a nice
and they know they have to put budget to it too, right? It's like emergency preparedness is a big ticket item. This is not like some soft thing that like we're like thinking about, like we're doing it.
And another nice property is it gets us away from some of the debates on like exactly how likely is a particular threat from occurring. I think the preparedness world is much more comfortable saying, hey, we are dealing with very uncertain events. We don't know exactly what, so-and-so terrorist group is going to do, or exactly how so-and-so state actor might get nuclear weapon. But what we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, we're going to try to map out any threats that seem credible, that seem plausible, and make sure we're prepared for them. And that's a very different type of conversation than conversations that are like, this is going to happen with 99% or like 90% certainty, right? With AI, I think there's an understanding that people are not very good at predicting things. I mean, certainly government people are very, much like, hey, we don't know what's going on here. We don't understand how the technology works. And so the preparedness frame says you don't need to have certainty. You don't need to understand exactly what risks are worth paying the most attention to. But if they meet some sort of threshold of plausibility, if there are at least some credible experts who are worried about these really big impact events, big impact national security threats, we should probably have a playbook in place to make sure we are doing the right things to detect those threats. And if we detect something, we're not just like figuring out on the fly, oh, what do we do now? We've had some people thinking about if we see X, we should do Y.
Yeah, that's so good. Because if you think about it in the terms of like a terrorist attack or something, or even like an asteroid or anything, it'd be like, we have this department associated with this. We have this budget allocated to this. We have no idea when it's going to happen. And that's a ridiculous question to ask. When is the asteroid going to come? We don't know, but we just know that we're using the best tech and the best people to prepare for it should it come, right? That's such a better framework than like, you need to tell me exactly how it's going to happen and when before I'll move a finger.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I think I think Helen Toner had a TED Talk recently where she expressed a similar sentiment, where she was talking about how a lot of policymakers are not confident about the technology, where it's heading, how quickly it's moving. And one of the big challenges of AI policy is sort of regulation under uncertainty, or sort of governance under uncertainty. And I think she was trying to make the point, and I agree with this point, that if I'm recalling her stuff correctly, that one of the big opportunities for policymakers right now is to be empowered to have opinions about AI and AI governance and make sort of informed choices, despite the fact that we're not going to have full certainty. And waiting for full certainty might not be the best strategy here, or, like, in my opinion, wouldn't be the best strategy here.
Of course, right. I mean, imagine, waiting to have the pandemic to have your pandemic strategy. Like, whether
it's a great example. I'm writing a piece right now about a very short piece about what kinds of lessons AI policy or AI emergency preparedness folks might be able to draw from pandemic preparedness. And I'm not an expert in pandemic preparedness. I've been reaching out to some folks who are more expert in bio stuff and pandemic preparedness stuff. But one of the really interesting things is that after COVID, the federal government established the Office of Pandemic Preparedness and Response Policy. And This is within the White House, so it's very directly reporting to the president. And basically the idea here is, hey, before COVID, we had a bunch of scattered efforts. People were thinking seriously about pandemics, but there wasn't really a centralized, coordinated place that was like, hey, if stuff's going down, you guys are the ones who are going to, pull the trigger, tell the president something needs to happen, and you're developing the playbook of response options. You're helping coordinate the other agencies that are interested and have expertise in pandemic response stuff. And so in this piece, I'm exploring, like, what it might look like to have something similar, like an office or a unit that is focused on AI emergency preparedness and response policy, and, like, what kinds of things can we learn from the establishment of the pandemic preparedness office that we might want to apply to AI. And, sadly, with pandemics, the office wasn't established until after COVID, right? It was sort of a like, oh, we didn't have this in place. Maybe this will be useful for future pandemics. The ideal, in my opinion, would be to have something like this for AI national security threats in advance, to be, proactive rather than reactive. But we'll see, how the conversations unfold.
Absolutely. So one of the things that first brought you to my attention was this paper you wrote about all your visits with the congressional offices. I'd love to get into that a little bit. So you've had, I don't know what the total is now. It's certainly more than 80 visits where you are either Zooming or in person with a congressional staffer trying to get their members' attention about AI X risk. Tell me about, and our audience, about those meetings, how you put them together, how they're going. Let's get into that.
Sure. One of my favorite things to talk about. Let's see, where do I start? One thing I was surprised by is just how much interest and enthusiasm there is here. With a lot of other topics, it's much harder to get staffer attention, much harder to get attention from relevant agency experts. But we really are in an optimistic, or sort of in a pleasant scenario where Congress and executive branch agencies are really, really interested to learn more about AI, to learn more about AI risks. In particular, the AI and national security space, I think, is extremely interested in getting more consultations with outside groups and outside experts. And when I first started, I wasn't sure, like, how hard it would be, right? At the time I started really reaching out to congressional offices, I was at the Center for AI Safety. And this is a group that I'm sure many listeners of the podcast would know. But in D.C., it didn't really have much of a presence, especially before the case statement on AI risk, which put case a little bit more on the map. But what I think people underestimate sometimes is the groups that are well known in the AI world and the AI safety world are not necessarily well known in D.C. Think tanks like, Brookings and CSAT and RAND and Cato, they've been in DC for decades. So even the Center for AI Safety, or say Control AI, or say some of the newer AI groups who are getting involved, no one's ever heard of you, right? Like they might kind of be like, oh, I might have heard of that. and some of the maybe like top 10% most engaged staffers and agency experts would know, but most people wouldn't. So I was surprised. This is just a long rambly way of saying I was surprised at how much response I got, despite the fact that I was coming in like as a new person from an organization a lot of people have never heard of. That's one promising thing. And then in terms of what to actually talk about, I think like what I said earlier is quite relevant, where like I think it's important to come in with a sort of assume that they might just want to listen, or they might not really be prepared to bring up like super specific questions yet. So assume that you need to be driving the agenda and you have a thing that you want them to know about, or you have a thing that you want to share with them. But then make it clear early in the meeting that if they want to talk about other stuff, they can. And I think roughly maybe 25% of the time, I've encountered like, hey, here's what I want to talk about. And they're like, oh, cool. But also, I really want to talk about this. Or also, I found, what is your stance on this totally different thing? So giving them the opportunity to do that is valuable. I think another thing I would say is that I didn't appreciate how much delegation there is in Congress. The committee structure matters a ton, and people who are familiar with DC will be like, this is the most obvious thing in the world, but I think a lot of AI people don't understand. So each congressperson is assigned to committees. There's committees on agriculture, there's committees on science and technology, there's committees on homeland security and defense stuff. And typically, a congressperson will really just be focused on the issues of their committees and maybe one or two other pet issues that might go outside of the committees. So even though like the whole of Congress, for the most part, is quite interested in AI education, it's actually not that hard to narrow down to like who are the 20 or 30 key people who will be thinking the most about AI in the context of national security. The folks on the armed services committees and the folks on the homeland security committees, for example, being some of the most relevant there. With of course, since AI is touching so many things, the U.S. AI Safety Institute is based at Commerce, so the Commerce committees matter. Energy is doing some stuff. So I'm not saying it's like only those people, but I think it helped me get a better sense of how to strategize here. Like, is it really like you're just supposed to go to like all 400 plus offices, or is there more of a prioritization? And when you go to certain offices, how do you know what their perspective is going to be? Well, if they're on the Commerce Committee, they're probably going to be on average interested in different things than if they're on the Armed Services Committee or the Homeland Security Committee.
Sure. What is your sense of, from the meetings you've had, just back to our conversation just a moment ago about X-risk versus job loss versus terrorism? Are there, I don't know, if you had 100 points and you had 3 buckets, where do you put the points in terms of where their head's at, the average congressional office?
Oh, where their head is at, yeah.
Yeah.
I would say probably like 80 points on competitiveness in China.
Wow.
That is definitely the most commonly, that's the most biggest concern in the heads of, I think, policymakers. Because for a lot of other national security threats that involve emerging technology, you're not worried about like misalignment or like the technology autonomously doing things. You're just worried about bad actors for the most part. And I think there's a big bipartisan sentiment right now that's very critical of and skeptical of China and really wants to make sure the U.S. stays ahead of China in terms of AI cutting edge technologies. So I'd say any place there. Mm-hmm.
How do you handle that? What is your approach to the, we can't stop because China will just get it and then dominate us? And the first thing I go to in my head is that, like, from everything I read, AGI is not going to care about the nationality of its creator or have any loyalty to anything that is pink, squishy, and filled with meat. But how do you go at the China problem?
Yeah, no, that's one of the $1 million questions right now for U.S. policy, especially national security focused policy. I think that one of the most important things to be doing right now is raising awareness about some of the intelligence explosion, AI research and development, misalignment, loss of control types of threat models. Because I think I don't think it's really about convincing people that they should feel one way or another about China. Like, I'm not a China expert. I think a lot of policymakers have thought way more about China and how well they are at, cooperating in international agreements than I have. That's not going to be my value add. My value add is going to be saying, hey, this is a unique kind of issue where not only do you have to factor in all of your beliefs about U.S.-China competitiveness, but also there's this misalignment thing you have to worry about. There's this loss of control thing you have to worry about. If we go too quickly without the proper safeguards, if the competitive pressures continue and we develop really powerful AI systems without the proper governance techniques, it's not going to matter if we get there first. It's going to be bad for everyone, right? And I think breaking that down for people is useful, and it doesn't have to go against whatever kind of philosophy they already have toward China. It just makes the problem more complicated, right? It means that now we can't treat this the same exact way as we treat other types of threats from emerging technology.
Do they buy that, or do they fight you on that principle that, like, no, the American human-made AGI is going to love Americans and humans?
I think mostly they are just open-minded right now, honestly, which has been promising. Like, I don't think they necessarily fully agree, but they certainly don't fully disagree. I think a lot of folks are just forming their opinions and they want to sort of hear what all sorts of experts are saying. And I think when you say things like, hey, Sam Altman, Dario Amodei, you have to sort of, Sam Altman, CEO of OpenAI, Dario Amodei, CEO of Anthropic, right? Like, there's so much jargon that we kind of know, but, you explain. Jeffrey Hinton, Yoshua Bengio, major computer scientists, considered godfathers of AI. These folks are very concerned about, extreme national security risks from AI, including extinction risks. Yoshua Bengio, who testified at the Schumer Insight Forums, is especially concerned about rogue AI scenarios where AI is doing things that the developers didn't intend, that they're escaping the control techniques, and that we might need to have a much more cautious and security-focused AI development paradigm before we reach those types of systems. I don't think they necessarily, if you ask them, how confident are you that Akash is correct versus incorrect? I think they'd be like, oh, I have no idea. But I think especially if they believe that a lot of experts are worried about this, that's where the preparedness frame, I think, comes in well. It's like, okay, I don't know if this is going to happen or not. I'm a policymaker. I'm not an AI expert. But whoa, it seems like there's reason to be concerned to the level where we invest more resources into preparing for these kinds of threats. I think that's sort of the main approach I've been taking so far. And I think getting people to have a better sense of what kinds of things might need to be done once, the risks are well accepted enough seems quite valuable right now as well.
Sure. And let's talk about the difference between viewing AI risk from sort of a commerce perspective and a national security perspective.
Sure.
And the impact that has. Obviously, we have the new U.S. AI Safety Institute headed by Paul Cristiano, which, I think was a very exciting development for people who care about AI risk like you and I do. But it's under the Commerce Department. And, that sort of puts it into like we're just trying to make this business operate as a good business. And these are business regulations we're making, not like these are Department of Defense level, we're all going to die regulations we need to make. Talk about the difference between national security and commerce and where it is and where it's heading.
Sure. Yeah, this is a really interesting topic. So one thing I'll just clarify is I think Paul was appointed as the head of AI safety, but he's not like the executive director or head of the whole thing. That's Elizabeth Kelly, and I think the chief technology officer is Elam. I always forget how to pronounce her name, but Elam Tabasi. So Paul's high up, but not like the one who's in charge of
Got it. Okay. Okay.
And then the other question was like, commerce versus like more national security focused. One thing I didn't appreciate until I started talking to more people in DC and learning more is that even though commerce has this name that makes it seem like it's just about like the economy and trade and, money and stuff, commerce actually does a lot relating to national security. And I think it's important to have like a fair amount of respect for some of the work they do in this realm. Most notably, BIS, the Bureau of Industry and Security, has been in charge of a lot of the export controls on various technologies, including semiconductors, and that definitely intersects a lot with the national security world.
Wow. So when we only allow China to sell the watered down NVIDIA, the only allow NVIDIA to give China the watered down chips, it's the Commerce Department.
It's the Commerce Department, and
affecting that.
They coordinate with some other agencies as well, right? Like a lot of government stuff involves, people from the intelligence community sharing information or people from the defense community getting involved. But it is primarily BIS through the Commerce Department that is responsible for the export control enforcement. And it's primarily the Secretary of Commerce, interestingly enough, that is involved in figuring out what kinds of technologies should we include on the list, or when should we update the export controls and all of that stuff. So I think it's plausible that commerce could rise to the occasion in some ways. And I think a lot of folks seem to be very impressed with commerce's ability to adapt to the AI national security threats. Obviously, NIST was already thinking a bit about AI and has the AI risk management framework. But I do think there's something to the sort of point I think you're pointing at, which is commerce also is responsible for so much else. NIST is primarily and traditionally a voluntary industry standards group. NIST brings companies together for technologies that typically don't have nearly as severe national security threats and says, okay, how do we design safe, whatevers, right? And that means that traditionally their expertise is in having these partnerships with industry, doing a lot of roundtables with industry, coming up with good voluntary standards. And I think it's reasonable for people who are very concerned about the AI national security threats to say, wait, is this the most natural place for an agency that would be tasked with preparing us for and evaluating some of the threats from the most severe, national security threats from AI. With that in mind, I think in some ways the ship has sailed, at least in terms of the U.S. AI Safety Institute being in commerce, and I think now it's just our job to make sure that it goes as well as possible. It's plausible to me that maybe something else could be based in the Department of Homeland Security or the Department of Defense or the Department of Energy, and there are some proposals that have been floating around for, if we had a licensing agency, where would that go? If we had a preparedness unit, where would that go? But yeah, I think one thing that I will be watching for, and I think a lot of people will be watching for with the U.S. AI Safety Institute, is how well is Commerce able to adapt to, and how well is NIST in particular able to adapt to doing something so much more national security focused than a lot of their historical work.
Yeah, this is a little bit of a dark thought, but I read on Twitter and sometimes think about people talking about how maybe the world's wake-up call on AI is going to be something that is not lights out for everyone, but is lights out for 500,000 or 1 million or a couple of million people, like some really bad thing happens. Could you envision a world where there'd be some horrible AI incident where 1 million people die and the Department of Defense would say, actually, we're taking that now. It's national security now. It's ours.
Yeah, I could. And I think even though it's very, upsetting to think about these kinds of scenarios, I think one of the areas where I think AI policy folks who have these bigger term risks in mind might want to focus some of their energy is figuring out what kinds of proposals might be most important to implement and most useful to implement in the event of some sort of disaster scenario or some sort of crisis from AI. I think it relates to a lot of the preparedness work I'm talking to, right? Like, ideally, we're proactive. We get the preparedness in place in time before the first major severe national security incident from AI. But it's possible we don't, and then it's still good to have some of these ideas around so that if there's some sort of major uptick in political will to do something, if the risks become clearer because they have already manifested in some way, I think that's very valuable. Unfortunately, there's also some concerns around, what if the first what if the first manifested threat is so severe that we can't rely on, some AI cyber attack that puts down critical infrastructure for a few weeks, and then, okay, that serves as a wake-up call. What if actually the problems with some of the models are pretty fixable until you get to a certain power threshold where they're so strong and so well integrated into society that the first major wake-up call is actually already too late. For both because I think it's just good to be proactive in general, and because I don't think we can necessarily rely on some sort of wake-up call. I think a lot of the other work is also important, but at this point I'm just rambling.
Sure. No, that's good. It reminds me of I saw Paul Cristiano on a podcast one time talking about he thinks that, he has a 50-50 PDUM, and he thinks that by the time it gets to the point where we could really lose to the AIs, that there will be so many physical implementations, physical robots and AI in the physical world so obviously that it would be obvious to everyone, like, oh shit, if these turn on us, if we lose control of this thing, yes, I'm so toast, because literally, like, my toaster, my microwave, my dish cleaning robot, everything, if they all came from me in my sleep, it would just, they'd win. What do you think of the whatever his role is at the Institute, having that 50% chance we all die from AI? And do you think that voice, like, if you said to people, I don't know if you use that in your arguments, but I've been using that lately, is like, hey, this guy who is running the AI safety, the first U.S. AI Safety Institute, he personally believes there's a 50% chance that AI kills all living things on Earth. That is an incredibly powerful statement if people can fully absorb it. How do you use Cristiano's beliefs in your work?
Yeah. I mean, I think that just raising awareness about a lot of the experts in the space that are concerned has been useful. It does make it easier to just sort of very quickly get people to realize, oh, this is a big deal. I've mentioned Paul's statement that there's like a 50% chance of some sort of catastrophe. I've mentioned Sam Altman mentioning that he believes super intelligent machines, or I think he used superhuman machines or something like that, are the greatest threat to humanity, greatest existential threat to humanity. Anthropic CEO Dario Amodei recently, well, not super recently, but a few months ago maybe, said that he believes there's a 1 in 4 chance of catastrophe. So it's like, hey, the people who are in charge of building these things, and now with Paul, some of the people who are in charge of the government's safety response to these things, or safety evaluations of these things, are extremely concerned. Ian Hogarth is another example. He's one of the leaders of the UK AI Safety Institute, and he has an excellent Financial Times article about the race toward godlike AI, and he makes a lot of the same points about competitive pressures and race dynamics and loss of control scenarios being particularly concerning. And then Yoshua Bengio, of course, godfather of AI, blah, 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 big important professor, testified at the Schumer Insight Forums, being especially concerned about rogue AIs. I think I want to, maybe as a result of saying all of that, here's maybe the high level point. I think it's important to mention the percent that people give for these kinds of catastrophes, but I think it's also important to ground that in some of the specific threat models. One thing I'm worried about is people are just going to hear, oh, big chance of catastrophe. That must be because China, or that must be because bioweapons, and maybe miss some of the more nuanced explanation of like, why does Paul think 50%? It's not because 49 of that percent is China, right? It's in fact very little, some of it is, but a lot of it is this other stuff.
Sure. How about regular people, like, the general public who this podcast is for entirely? Like, a lot of our viewers and listeners have been engaging with their congressional offices, trying to reach out to politicians. What is your sense of what's the most effective way to do that? How do the offices themselves engage with the public in a way that's the most effective?
Yeah. So definitely not an expert here. I'll just kind of vibe it. So people, if I'm wrong, should definitely trust, the other sources.
Sure.
But I've been interested in how much people in DC actually genuinely seem to think that like ordinary people reaching out to congressional offices with letters or emails is actually something that gets on their radar. Particularly if, or like really if you're a constituent. If you are from
you got that zip code, they care.
Yeah, if you're from New York and you can figure out who your representative is from your district, and you can message your senators. Like I can pretty much guarantee that like if your little letter or email gets to the office, there's someone who's logging, oh, okay, this is a New York voter who is reaching out to us with this concern. And so few people do this that it is actually pretty meaningful, even if only, let's say, I don't know, a few people or let's say a dozen or 24 people do it on a particular issue. There is a staffer at most offices, is my impression, that is like flagging these kinds of things. And it's not like you're going to convince them of an entirely different position, unless you're like a really, really good writer, in which case, like, email John, email me, like we should get in touch. But what you are going to do is you're going to raise the profile of the issue. Congress is just, there's so much. Like, I think that's something I didn't appreciate until being in DC fully viscerally. But like these poor staffers sometimes are tasked with like managing so many different issues in their portfolio, and congressional offices are tasked with thinking about so many different things. If we can make it so that, hey, I don't really know why, but people in our constituency do seem to be really spooked about AI, and in particular AI from this national security perspective, I think that can influence just the prioritization of offices, or at least make offices aware that this is something that they should be investing more into, and tracking more and putting more staffer time into. So that's a big one, reaching out to folks, especially reaching out to folks who you could vote for, right? Other stuff ordinary people can do, I think just like blogging and tweeting can go a long way. I think people sometimes also underestimate how hard it is, overestimate how hard it is to contribute something meaningful to the dialogue. There are a bunch of open questions that people don't have answers to. There's a bunch of stuff that's been written about before, but from the perspective of like nerdy Silicon Valley AI person. And I think there's a lot of room to just like rehash certain concerns with a different voice, with a different perspective. Yeah. And some folks who I'm very impressed with in terms of like their blogs or in terms of their Twitter presence, it's a lot of them just sort of having a raw, authentic reaction to some of the AI content. And not to say everyone who is concerned should work in the space or needs to work in the space, but it's also a great way to, if you have writing out there, you have these appearances out there, it's a great way to get noticed by people in the space and learn more about opportunities that there might actually be to get involved in the space.
Yeah. What do you think about protest and the role of protest in all this? Do you find it helpful? Do you think it's useful? What are your views on protest?
Yeah. Not a protest expert either. And I think protests are kind of thorny to think about because even right with the recent student protests around Israel, I feel like in some ways it's like raised a lot of awareness, but then people who are against the protests are making arguments that maybe they're counterproductive. And I'm not smart enough or expert enough to know when the
like who's winning that thing.
Who's winning that idea. Thing? When is the backfire risk actually more concerning than the actually raising awareness? I'm a bit so then with all of that uncertainty in mind. I just think people should protest if they feel like they are motivated to protest. I think there are definitely cases in which protests have been extremely influential on policy. One of the most interesting books I've read in the last year is the biography of Lyndon B. Johnson by Robert Caro. He actually wrote 4 books about Lyndon Johnson because he's obsessed, and the books are amazing. But one of them that I read was, it's called Master of the Senate, and it's basically about how Johnson rises up as this like young senator and becomes one of the most influential Senate majority leaders in American history, and eventually goes on to become president. And one of the big things in that book that's really interesting is it really paints Johnson as someone who is like going to do the thing that gets him more political power and advances his career. Basically, no matter what, like you can think of him as like fairly unscrupulous and just like, all right, I will do the thing that helps me advance my interests, my like personal political interests. And what that looks like for the first several years and maybe even decades of Johnson's career is allying with the Southern Democrats who are pretty against civil rights legislation. And he's very publicly, very vocally, just on their side, votes always on their side. And then as public opinion shifts and as Johnson is like, wait, I might want to be president, he starts to have to redo the calculations. Like his ability to have power as a senator before civil rights was blowing up so much was linked to his continued support against civil rights. And then partially as a result of the widespread public opinion and the widespread protests and the widespread awareness that people were raising about civil rights, Johnson actually changed it. And it's hard to know if he actually changes his mind, because the whole point of Robert Caro's book is like, you never really know what Johnson actually believes is right. But he at least changes his actions. He starts to actually fight for civil rights and was extremely influential in getting the Civil Rights Act of, I believe, 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 passed. And Robert Caro really sells it as like he would not have done this unless it was in his political interests to do so, most likely. So,
and is it fair to say like the way he understood it to be in his political interest was because of the protests and you know the unrelenting nature of just like, we're going to put this in your face,
I think
forced him?
It was based on his assessment of, this is an issue that voters really care about, and this is an issue where I need to be on the right side of what voters want. And my guess is that there are ways to communicate that maybe don't necessarily involve the specific tactic of protests. But in the case of the civil rights movement, the protests were extremely influential in making it clear to the public and to policymakers that this was an issue that so many people were really concerned about, were willing to vote based on, were willing to like criticize politicians based on, were willing to donate to politicians based on. So even though Robert Caro doesn't talk specifically about was it the protests or was it just the overall zeitgeist of America in other ways, my impression is that the protests are part of what got this overall like sort of societal momentum going that political leaders who were very politically savvy like Johnson would be able to take note of.
Sure. I'm not sure how much stock you can put in polling, because I don't believe that the average person responding to a poll really understands AI enough to like actually meaningfully respond. However, polling does seem to indicate by a margin greater than almost any other political issue, at least in America and the international polling, it seems like the general public is pretty well aligned that AI is really scary, seems really dangerous, and we should probably be a whole lot more cautious than we are being. That there seems to be, you know, this is my poll of polls in my head, but 70 to 80% support in the general public to like really slow the hell down and really strongly regulate AI right now. Is that your read of it?
Yeah, and I think we shouldn't take that for granted. I think the limitations you mentioned are important, like people's minds could change. I also think in addition to just like what does someone believe, there's also a question of like how high is it in their priority list? And often, right, the issues that are higher priority are going to be more important in the minds of politicians. But, you know, before the polls were released, so many people in the Bay Area were like, the public will never want to regulate AI. Obviously, they'll see AI as this amazing innovation for society that's going to solve all our problems. And I think the people who were saying that were either wrong or actively misleading. And I think it is a mix of both, because it's a narrative that is, I think, very tied to a lot of people's financial interests. And so I don't take the polls for granted. I think this was a pretty major moment for me and others who were sort of wondering, like, you know, how much will talking to the public about AI and AI safety really matter? How much will talking to policymakers about AI and AI safety really matter? Maybe it is just something where we need to rely on the goodwill of the companies and sort of try to inform some of the policies of the companies. And I now look back at, you know, Akash from a year ago or 2 years ago, and I'm like, wow, like, that's not what you believe in. You know, you were pretty off there. The public and policymakers are quite concerned about AI and AI national security threats. And I go as far as to say, like, perhaps there were certain, you know, forces in the water that were present, intentionally so, that were making it less likely that people like me and other people in the AI safety world would have seen public outreach or policymaker outreach as legitimate strategies. Certainly, if I was running a frontier AI company and I wanted to say, okay, what are things that I want this AI safety community to believe as I try to get toward this like really economically lucrative technology. I might want to spread certain memes, or at least enhance and amplify certain memes that are skeptical of like, oh, the public, they're never going to be meaningful contributors here, or policy, oh, government never knows how to regulate technology. Why would we get them involved?
Yeah.
Just trust me. I'm the good guy, CEO. So yeah, I think this ended up being a bit of a ramble, but I do think that I've been impressed with the polls. I think they do mean something, and I think that I'm more convinced than I was, say, a year ago or 2 years ago, that the public response and perhaps even more importantly, the policymaker response, but the two are interlinked, is going to be pretty crucial for reducing some of the major risks we're concerned about.
Yeah, I mean, as Sam Altman speaks, it seems like baked in to everything he says. And as I watch him talk now, I'm like, that's 90% like a used car salesman and 10% like a tech guy. Like most of it is like crappy sales techniques, but he goes with this like presumptive presentation that like, of course everyone wants this. So now let me talk about what it is. But jumps right over this, like, everyone obviously wants what I'm doing. Of course, that, we can't even talk about that. And as the public sort of like gets awareness of what that is, they're like, no, dude, like, we don't want this. You don't have our consent for this. What are you talking about? And I don't think he realizes that. I don't think anybody in that bubble really realizes that. But I think that is the reaction that the rest of the country is having.
And it's been a really interesting thing being based in the Bay Area for so long and now being based in DC and just seeing the cultural differences toward AI companies and toward government, right? In the Bay Area, and not saying that like Sam in particular is particularly susceptible, but like I'm a psychologist by training. Social psychology is all about how the people we're around influence our beliefs and the way we're thinking about the world. I think there is something to be said about the fact that the Bay Area, Silicon Valley-esque community attracts a lot of people who sort of, it's self-evident to them why artificial general intelligence would be amazing for society. It's self-evident to them that technology is the way of improving society. And there's some out-of-touchness, right? There's also a lot of skepticism of government. Like, they will cite the 15 things that government obviously failed at and sucks at. Whereas in DC, you have a very different approach. And I'm not saying that DC is necessarily closer to the objective truth, but it's just interesting to have the contrast where DC will point to a bunch of the stuff that big tech companies have done that have made the world worse, or lies that big tech companies have told, or ways in which big tech companies have abused their power with social media or abused their power with data privacy legislation. DC will talk about how the national security establishment is not going to like sit back and sleep as very dangerous AI systems are being built. DC will talk about how, even though government is super dysfunctional, that's something that I think everyone kind of in the country is sort of agreeing on right now, there's so much interest in AI, and AI might be one exception to the sort of general dysfunction of Congress. And if there is evidence, and I'm currently convinced there's evidence, and I think a lot of people are raising awareness about the evidence and also acquiring new evidence that the risks are real, there are cases where once there's a strong enough national security threat or awareness of a strong enough national security threat, that even the dysfunctional Congress that we have, or even the relatively hard to move things in bureaucracy that we have, is willing to take action, and often willing to take action that's actually quite reasonable in hindsight, that like actually protects Americans and the world. So it's just interesting being around different cultural forces. I don't think that the Bay Area people are completely wrong. I think the government gets stuff wrong all the time. I don't think the DC people are completely right or wrong. But I do think that people based in the Bay Area, or people who like only sort of follow the like AI people on Twitter or social media, or are around them, might have a skewed perception about what the public thinks or what the policy community thinks and what they're willing to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's Eliezer Yudkowsky opened my eyes to this whole thing with this article in Time more than a year ago, and he came out after that and was like, genuinely surprised at how well the public had taken it. it's so fascinating because I think this is really at the core of it. Like if we could make the people in the bubble, in the valley, understand the fear from the risk that the rest of us are feeling, I would hope that it would change their perspective. But if you're saying it's this sort of like self-selecting, self-sustaining bubble where their biases are just bounced off each other and they don't worry about what's outside the bubble, that seems to me like what's happening. That seems to me like what I hear when I hear Sam Altman talk.
And I think there's some degree of the bubble popping, and I think there's been more engagement between like the Silicon Valley folks and the policy community, especially as people are starting to worry, right? Like even with the California bill, we're seeing people who have either economic interests or just like a really strong philosophical orientation toward technology being the thing that's going to save us. You're seeing a lot of people getting angry and annoyed and upset and scared about potential government involvement. You're seeing labs start to hire more and more government affairs people and lobbyists. You're seeing Microsoft, Facebook, Google, existing lobbyists focus more on AI and less on all the other tech issues. So it's like things are heating up, and I think that does mean there's more exchange of ideas between the Bay Area folks and the DC folks, which is interesting and exciting. But also it's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out. And of course, some of the tech companies, especially the bigger tech companies, have a lot of experience talking to folks in DC, influencing the policy conversation.
Oh yeah, built up relationships. I was curious about that. Like, do you ever on the elevators in Congress, you ever bump elbows with your competition?
Yeah, I mean, and competition. I think as much as I will critique some of the labs when I think they're doing things that are wrong, I think there are some policies that a lot of people seem to be getting on board with or agreeing to. But I mean, sometimes I'm at a happy hour and I don't know who I'm talking to. And I'm like, oh, where do you work? And it's like, a lobbyist from one of the big AI companies or someone who's at a think tank or advocacy group that is like their main sponsors are the big tech companies. So, it's interesting. I get into debates sometimes. I think mostly I try to focus on some of the folks who are still learning about the space and open-minded. I think it's often, it's harder to convince than it is to just like inform. But occasionally I'll I have a few colleagues here now who definitely come at things from different angles than I do, and it's fun to debate with them. And and sometimes I change my mind about certain things, and I'm like, oh no, you're right.
Yeah.
Like there are some ways in which the company's internal governance policies or certain public statements they've made are helpful in terms of moving the needle on regulation. And there are some things that the people who, want regulation really do need to figure out. There are some holes in some of the proposals. There are some, things that haven't been ironed out fully that are important for us to be, aware of. And maybe folks who are, not on our team all the time might be some of the best folks to help us find the holes and the proposals we're pushing.
Yeah. How about the upcoming AI Safety Summit in Seoul, South Korea, the second one? What are your highest hopes for that?
Yeah, highest hopes for Seoul. So I honestly don't know that much about the Seoul Summit. It hasn't been one of the areas I've been focusing on.
Yeah.
But I can just speculate in terms of like in general what I want out of the next summit.
Yeah.
I think one of the great things from the UK summit was the sort of emphasis on international cooperation. It did seem like bringing together, Western leaders and folks from China and folks from all over the world and talking about the risks was quite valuable. I think one way to go beyond this is to have actual red lines. It would be nice to see people agree on like, these are things that we think are not okay. If you start to get autonomous replication, if you start to get like massive improvements in AI research and development, if you start to get AI that can develop new types of weapons of mass destruction, we're all going to say no to that, and we're going to, we might not have the exact regulations yet that we need to prevent that, but we're all going to go back to our home countries and work on getting those red lines implemented somehow. I think that would be one promising sign. I think another thing that I really want to see discussed is right now, so many folks are interested in model evaluations, right? Evaluate the risks. And that's good. And, it's one helpful perspective. But I think people should be thinking more about this sort of critical question: what happens when the evals go off? Like, what is the plan when your UK AI Safety Institute or US AI Safety Institute or, safety experts in China end up saying, hey, guys,
the bell went off, the alarm went off. What are we going to do?
Like, this model that we actually have in this lab, and maybe it's a startup that doesn't have super great information security protections, it can meaningfully help people's ability to come up with new kinds of insights to develop new kinds of weapons of mass destruction, where it looks like we have early warning signs that capability growth might go like very, very sharply might sharply increase before our safeguards are ready. And if we have this, then the company behind us might only be 1 or 2 months away, and we don't know what's going on in China. And then all of a sudden we're in sort of panic mode. Like, I think, I want to see more discussions at events like the AI Safety Summit on like, how do we try to avoid panic mode? Like, when the evals go off, what is the plan? And this, of course, relates to preparedness, which is, of course, the thing I've been focusing so much about, and it all kind of links.
Right, it circles right back. I love it. I love emergency preparedness as a brand for all of this. I think it's so rooted in common real world today, where this, the problem for this whole thing is it's so disconnected from our current reality. So to tie it back to real things that really get attention now, I think is super smart.
Yeah. And I think people get it when I describe it to them. Like, the words are chosen intentionally. Preparedness is about preparing for something that might be a big deal, even if you're not fully sure it's going to happen. And emergency really evokes the sense of like, it could be sudden, and it could be something we need to react to quickly. It's not like some sort of, in general, we need to regulate emerging tech. It's like it's a crisis that we need to be prepared for, or there are some crisis scenarios that we need to be prepared for.
Right. And it's like, when you're in Wyoming, they say, here's a can of bear spray if you're going to go off on the trail. Nobody has to say like, oh, at 7:32 tonight, I'm going to confront 207-pound bear, and this is how it's going to go down. It's like, no, if you're going in the woods at night, you should bring the bear spray.
Exactly. Like, there are some precautions that just make sense because you want to be safe, right? No one needs to say we're fully confident that there's a 14% chance that you're going to encounter a bear, and we have these bear evals in place, and we're only going to give you the bear spray once the bear evals trigger. Like, if you're within 500 feet of a bear, then we'll start thinking about how to make sure you can handle the bear, right?
Right. Yeah, and so like one of the most ridiculous things from the leaders of the AI labs to me currently is this idea that, there's this red line that you describe, it's hidden, nobody knows what it is, but we're going to hit it. We're going to be like, oh my God, we need to stop like right now, this hour. We're going to then immediately communicate that to all of our competitive companies and nations, and they're all going to immediately agree and do it. It seems beyond ludicrous. So I think at least saying like, what that line is and how that telephone tree, right, like might work is important work, even though I don't think there's any chance that if the red line was tripped and someone made the call, that every country and company would just stop. I just don't think it's a thing.
I mean, one nice thing is there aren't that many frontier players right now, so it's not inconceivable to me, and again, this goes into the preparedness stuff, it's not inconceivable to me that the U.S. government could have some hotlines that connect, say, OpenAI, Anthropic, Microsoft, Google, Facebook. They already have these kinds of things for other sorts of national security stuff, right? Like, big tech has been integrated in critical infrastructure and national security stuff for a while, so there's some preparedness that we can just draw from, and maybe include some of the top officials in Chinese AI companies. Obviously, this one gets more politically charged in terms of being careful about what's shared and all. There's also the Beijing Washington hotline, which is an already existing communication technique where if the U.S. is like, hey, there's a time-sensitive national security threat that we need to communicate with China or vice versa, we have that. Maybe making sure that we have the AI talent that we need to sort of be informing those national security groups, and maybe making sure that they're paying attention to the right information so that they catch the danger thing in time would be valuable. But I think it's not inconceivable to imagine that this kind of information sharing, risk sharing, coordination platform could exist. and maybe in some form it already does, although it might need to be improved in some ways. And then, of course, the bigger, in some ways, question, I think, is, not to trivialize that one, but then the next question is, well, what are you going to do, right? And I think one of the most important challenges in all of AI governance right now that I think more people could be thinking about, and is especially informing governments about, is how do we make sure that really powerful AI or artificial general intelligence or AI that can automate research and development isn't developed in the context of some race between Microsoft, Google, Facebook, OpenAI, Anthropic. What plans could we actually see being implemented that involve public-private partnerships or nationalization or some sort of single international or national AI project that is able to go more cautiously than you're able to go when you have a bunch of companies that are trying to be first to the market. So I think the main thing that would increase my optimism right now about overall AI risk would be some sort of plan that involves eliminating these race dynamics from the equation and getting us to the point where AGI development is occurring in a more safe and secure overall development ecosystem. And I think the summit, if the summit were to focus on that, or if I could pick one thing for the summit to focus on, it would probably be these kinds of conversations.
I love it. And so I always like to end on something that's sort of hopeful, say what, sort of gives you hope. Is it possible, you think, that the race conditions could be ended? Is that a possibility, the corporate or the national? I
think, yeah. I think the massive upsurge in interest in AI policy after GPT-4 or ChatGPT, or like both maybe, have been pretty promising signs. I think that in general, being in DC has updated me more toward the idea that there are serious national security people here who are not necessarily going to just like want to sit back and watch as companies develop things that typically people wouldn't really think companies should be allowed to develop. So it's plausible. There's going to be hurdles. I think it's plausible that we get some sort of AI system that can automate research and development without people really seeing why it's dangerous because they don't have the like intelligence explosion, AGI, misalignment, loss of control threat model. And then, the eval goes off and then people are like, well, okay, like you have an AI system that's like really good at coding. That's not that scary. And then, we get into a danger zone. I could see worlds where the influence of big tech is really hard to combat. I could see worlds in which the US-China relations play a big role in things. And maybe even if you get some sort of public-private partnership or nationalization scheme, there's still this pressure to race with China. So there are a lot of ways it could go wrong, right? But I don't think it's inconceivable to imagine that some sort of wake-up call thing gets activated, whether it's from an eval, whether it's from a whistleblower, whether it's from some sort of real-world disaster, unfortunately, that then induces pretty major government involvement for AI development past a certain threshold. And there are already some very good examples. I think one research project I might do at some point, but there's so much to think about. One research project I might want to do is looking at case studies of other public-private partnerships in the context of dangerous technologies. But on a high level, I think we were able to do a lot of international cooperation in the case of nuclear technologies. We were able to say that certain types of nuclear technologies that were dangerous to the point where, corporations should not be developing them. I don't think everything that happened in the area of nuclear energy regulation is perfect. And of course, a lot of the Bay Area people will point to the fact that there are ways in which the government might have over-regulated and sort of, decreased the potential for nuclear energy. But I think in the case of AI, there are some promising signs that some kinds of national or international arrangements that end or substantially reduce race dynamics could be possible.
All right, that is really hopeful, and I do appreciate that. My last question. So there's probably, 50, 100, 200 lobbyists on the side of big corporate tech versus you and your team. If we had to say the two teams, right, the one is incredibly well-funded and has a ton of bodies, and one is incredibly underfunded and does not have nearly enough bodies. if just that switched, right? This is just dream world hypothetical, and Team AI Safety Risk had all the bodies and all the money, and the other guys were in the minority, what would happen in that world?
Oh, that's a really weird and interesting question.
Like, would it be overnight? Yeah.
I think probably in that world, we would at the very least have considerably more oversight into what's going on. And probably we would be able to get something like compute-based licensing or compute-based limits where one of my favorite versions of this proposal is sort of a tiered approach to compute caps where there's some threshold where it's like, all right, anything below this threshold is fine, unregulated, do whatever you want. There's this middle zone where it's like, okay, there are some dangers here. We do think that they're manageable, though. We do think that, smart, secure companies will be able to manage them. So if you want to develop in this space, you have to be approved by a regulator. And then there's a threshold that's like, ooh, beyond this, we really don't know what we're doing. Or beyond this, maybe we know kind of what the capabilities are now, but we really don't have confidence that 2 years from now or 5 years from now, with post-training enhancements and new prompting techniques, they're going to be safe. So this is the ceiling. And if you want to do stuff above this, then you have to be part of the national DoD project or the international sort of CERN for AI project. And I think if the resources were flipped, I honestly think that would be achievable. I might be biased because I think it's a very logical way of handling the project, the problem. And I think without the influence of big tech and with sort of more sober, more kind of neutral, non-profit motivated thinking about that, I might be inclined to think that a lot of people would end up being persuaded by that. But who knows? I might be, it's hard to imagine what that world would even look like. And I think part of my model is that folks in the AI safety world would probably be more willing to support some of these stronger regulatory measures in the world where the resources were flipped. I think, obviously, a lot of people talk about concerns around regulatory capture. I think that for better or for, well, actually, I think I would say for worse in this case, the influence of big tech is not only on policymakers, the influence of big tech is on AI safety folks as well, especially in the Bay Area. There's such strong ties between a lot of the tech companies and a lot of the AI safety folks. And I imagine that this has led to a sort of skewed AI safety ecosystem where some of the folks who were advocating most for public outreach and policymaker outreach were sort of pushed aside, were considered less reasonable, less nuanced, less sophisticated thinkers by the maybe folks with the resources. And people who were amplified were people who were like, I don't know, I'm a safety person, but governments, I don't know, they often get things wrong, or I think OpenAI, we might be able to rely on them, they might be able to figure out alignment. So it's really hard to imagine what the world would look like with those resource flips. But I wouldn't be surprised if, for instance, some of the AI safety institutions or institutions that brand themselves as AI safety institutions would end up also being more proactive and pushing for stronger regulations in the world where the resources were flipped.
A resource flip. What a world that would be. So what do you think? How does AI safety as emergency preparedness sound to you? Let me know in the comments. Please keep your emails coming to me. I'd love to get them at forhumanitypodcast@gmail.com. And last but not least, it is 2024. We don't know when the singularity will come. We don't know how long we have to live, so we live every day like it's our last and end every show with a celebration of life, just something that makes us thrilled to be alive. Today's celebration comes from our guest, Akash.
And Hades is king of the scythe and the sword. He covers the world in the color of rust. He scrapes the sky and scars the earth, and he comes down heavy and hard on us. But even that hardest of hearts unhardened suddenly when he saw her there. the sun on her shoulders with her hair.
Beautiful. Okay, my friends, that is all for this week. Remember, AI risk is not someone else's problem. It is yours, and it is mine. Quoting Margaret Mead, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. For Humanity, I'm John Sherman. I'll see you right back here next week.